I come out of an ecology background back in the 50s, and so biodiversity is kind of the underlying thing I look at everything through, and how biological systems work, small scale and large scale. Climate came later, and it came later for a lot of people, and the environmental movement, I think Bill McKibben is right, is morphing into the climate change movement. But we haven't gotten all the way there yet. And climate change is a global problem. We've never really had one of those before. It's at least a century-sized problem. We've never had one of those before. It involves absolutely everybody because it's a result of aggregate human behavior, and we've never dealt with a problem like that before. So the whole problem set is both more profound and very strange compared to things that we've dealt with in the past, like local biodiversity and preserving a watershed, and getting endangered species protected, and preserving wildlands and things like that. So the changes are so profound that it's taking long time to sort them out, longer than it should in my view, because just thinking in terms of energy, you really want large quantities of really clean electricity, clean in terms of greenhouse gases. And right now, besides hydropower, there's only one major source of that, and that's nuclear. And so that involves taking a close look at nuclear. And once I started to do that, I realized that there was an ideological stance against nuclear that Greens had taken in the 20th century that was mostly ideological, not factual. And what I want is people involved in all this, the movement, I guess, to bear down on the facts, put the ideology aside for a while, and then look in global terms of what does it take to actually get, say, 16 terawatts of clean energy when we got 16 terawatts of mostly dirty energy now. And I don't think enough people have stepped up to what that means, not just in terms of nuclear, but in terms of fusion and other things we need to look at that can scale up and cut greenhouse gases back. It also means figuring that geoengineering, the ability to buy time, a couple of decades while we sort all this stuff out, is probably pretty important. And it should not take a generation to make those changes. I think the question civilization is facing in this century is, can democracies deal with climate change? Can democracies which are responsive to, appropriately and necessarily, to the concerns that people have, at least the majority of people have at any particular time. And climate has this peculiarity of always staying below a certain alarm threshold. Well, yeah, maybe there's a problem here, and yeah, it could be big sometime later. And so one of the things that changed the conversation was when we looked at the possibility of abrupt climate change. We did that at Global Business Network. And that then sort of gave people permission to think, well, it could happen suddenly, it could be terrible, it could happen on my watch, and and it was taken seriously. But then it didn't happen. I mean, the scenarios we did at GBN was in 2010, suddenly the Gulf Stream starts to shut off, and Europe goes dry and windy and cold, and it's horrible, and everybody has to do stuff. Well, 2010 came and went. None of those things occurred. So we know that's what you do with scenarios. You do things, and mostly they don't happen. But the people who were believing Al Gore that things were dire, a year goes by, another year goes by. Nothing dire has happened yet. And so the threshold of a Democratic majority of alarm says, well, that was last year's worry. It didn't happen, so let's worry about something else. Autocratic governments like Singapore, China, run largely by engineers and scientists by training, figure it's part of their government job to take the long term very seriously and to operate on what they understand about long-term issues for their nation. And so we're seeing China as a government, with all of its problems, acting much more seriously about climate change than any other large government. Right now we have the example of Germany planning to shut down its 17 nuclear reactors, providing 23% of the electricity for the country, and replacing it either with other people's nuclear or burning more of their own bad brown coal. And okay, it's a democracy, that's great, but it's also clear they're not serious about climate change. So, China versus Germany is one way, post-Fukushima, is one way to look at how this thing might play out. So will democracies hire governments that take the long term seriously with a century-sized problem that involves everybody? We don't know yet. Probably by the end of 2012, the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is working on a laser inertial fusion, doing extraordinary things. I mean, this is technological sublime. They have a machine that can deliver 1 trillion watts in billionths of a second on a target the size of a peppercorn. And that target is deuterium and tritium, basically hydrogen, 2 isotopes of hydrogen. Pretty accurate scientific theory says that you can get an inertial compression of that to the point where it cooks itself into a fusion event, tiny fusion event, which they call ignition. And 10 to 100 times the energy will come out from that goes in. And it's all over in a couple billionths of a second, but whew, there's a bunch of energy. So if you capture that and heat molten salt with it and do it 10 times a second, so we'll get ignition. That'll be amazing. That'll be the first sort of non-bomb fusion event of a tiny little sun. You get artificial sunlight out of this thing. If you can do that 10 times a second, which is then a decade's work probably, you've got a laser inertial fusion engine that can deliver, say, 1 gigawatt of electricity with none of the problems that we associate with fission. You can't use it for weapons, it doesn't melt down. You're not running out of hydrogen because it's large quantities of hydrogen, and you're not using very much anyway. And all of the things we worry about with fission, and waste products and waste stream and so on, none of that's there with fusion. If that looks like it can actually go forward, that could be a game changer. I think the green movement, what's left of it, is, I hope, in the process of moving from political mode of argument to a scientific mode of argument. And the political mode of argument has a lot to do with what you can get through Washington and what will play at the United Nations and things like this. Scientific argument is what's actually going on with stuff in the world, how energy actually plays out and things like this. And political arguments, one ideology against another, can go on basically forever without really changing very much. The wars come and go and that changes things, but the nature of the change is different with scientific argument, where you get results from your hypotheses play out or they don't, and the evidence shows that it's more likely this than that. We see a lot of this confusion in the debates about climate, where there's political, ideological debates about climate that are worth paying no attention to at all, and scientific debates about climate, which are really valid. There are a lot of people who have questions about the full-on alarmist view of how climate change might proceed, and that's the right thing. That's what scientists do for a living, is argue. But by and by, the data gets better, the models become more predictive, and you move on to the next thing to argue about. That's where I want to see the environmental movement go, that it becomes evidence-driven rather than ideology-driven. I think that the general principle that may be emerging now is that take things that are harmful to the environment and concentrate them. So killing wild fish in order to feed everybody has serious limitations. It's hurting the oceans in a profound way, in an absolutely widespread way. But good news is that more than half of the fish and shellfish that people now eat are coming from farmed fish, oysters and whatnot. And that could be a lot more. So concentrating it starts to free up the ocean. Likewise, food and fiber, if you can concentrate the more highly efficient corn into a smaller area, that's good. If you can grow your trees, which increasingly is the case in plantations, you can have really high quality wood for everything from plywood to pulp to lumber, and not cut down the wild forest in order to do it. That lets more wild forest grow. And likewise with people. If people have a big impact that starts to be problematic on the landscape, instead of being all spread out in these villages that we were supposed to worship, and they go into dense cities, that frees up the countryside. And that's not theory. People are leaving, thank God, all over the world, leaving the countryside, moving to town, because that's where opportunity is. It's where the women can get some education, and they can get health care for the kids and education for the kids, and get out of poverty. And as a result, one set of figures from the Food and Agriculture Administration is that 55 times more rainforest is now growing back as second growth than is being cut down as primary. And if there's some primary left nearby, the biodiversity comes very quickly back into the second growth. And the great thing about tropical rainforests is they grow fast. And so you can get very, very rapid recovery. And one of the things that Peter Kariba at this conference has been good on is how extraordinarily resilient and non-fragile most natural systems are. And if the human pressure backs off just a little bit, they come back fast. I think we're probably going to be learning as more and more studies are done of Fukushima, both what happened within the 3 reactors that melted down and the spent fuel pool that went somewhat dry, how to know exactly the results that came from those various very bad events, and managing hydrogen so that it doesn't explode on you and things like that. A lot of that's pretty technical, and engineers will bear down on it. And those lessons will be learned as they've been learned for 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and will be applied to everybody else's reactors. But also, I think we're going to get to do some serious research on the effects of the radiation that did escape. One of the reasons nobody was killed by the radiation, and nobody was even hurt by the radiation, is because we can measure it so well, and we have such good knowledge about what acute, short-term, high-level exposure can do to a person, any organism, that we are able to, even in the process of dealing in the midst of an earthquake and tsunami situation and total breakdown and everything, to have 3 simultaneous meltdowns, hydrogen explosions, and a spent fuel problem, and have nobody killed, is astonishing. So that's very interesting. Now we get to look at, are there lingering effects? And hopefully the epidemiology, the medical studies of people who were exposed, or the nearby areas that were evacuated, probably some pets that are still there and stuff like that. You'll get to see what's the lingering harm from that. So the kind of studies that were done after Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be done with more current medical knowledge, more current radiation sensing, so we'll get a good sense of who was exposed to what. Likewise in the ocean, here's what I bet, that the health of the ocean around Fukushima, in terms of fish and whatever else is growing there, will improve drastically, just like the wildlife around Chernobyl did, because fear of that radiation getting into sushi, into the fish that were caught and eaten from there, means that the fishing will stop, which means everything will come back very rapidly. And if they're smart, they'll probably turn it into a underwater reserve and let it continue to prosper. They will not find any two-headed fish. That keeps not happening whenever there's radiation. And so there may be a long period of interpretation of what actually happened, for good and ill. How long do some of the hot spots where radioactive material really fell in a pretty densely occupied area that was then evacuated, people always want to come back. They wanted to come back to Chernobyl. They come back, no bad thing happened to them. How will that play out? I'm hoping that the science will get done with proving that probably the theory that harm happens according to this theory of linear no threshold will be disproved. That this will force the very difficult research to find out, is any dosage harmful? This is the sort of hard over Helen Caldicott, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace view that any dosage of radiation is harmful. It's almost certainly wrong. And the research that follows on Fukushima, I expect, if it is done honestly and broadcast honestly, will satisfy people that that's the case, that low dosage over a long period of time is not as harmful as people thought. I guess I'm completely optimistic, and probably because I've spent my adult life in California. This is what the British always tell me, well, pay no attention to Brand, he's optimistic because he lives in California. Well, do pay attention to me because I'm optimistic because I live in California. I've seen Moore's Law play out in one technology where things just keep getting faster and cheaper and smarter and more efficient, and decade after decade. I think biotechnology and to some extent nanotechnology have those qualities. It's not so true of energy technology, but nevertheless occasionally you get a step function change, like potentially with fusion. So I think that technology is capable of rising to the occasion. Enough people are bearing down on it that it will rise to the occasion. I think that climate is going to have to scare us to death before we really, really do all that needs to be done. And climate is a weird thing in that anything that's less than 10 years long is not climate, it's weather. So people are now paying attention to climate, but we haven't been paying attention to climate in a massive democratic way long enough to take it seriously. So we've had a year with a lot of tornadoes, and another year we had a serious hurricane in Louisiana. And we're having more forest fires maybe, but we've got to have more tornadoes and more forest fires and more hurricanes for 10 years straight in order for people to actually say, this is climate. Now, field biologists I know that climate is happening because all the species that they study are moving uphill or moving north, because already the seasons are changing enough that the animals and the plants are moving to try to keep up with it. But that's not everybody's experience. So, it'll take sudden things. The West Antarctic ice sheet is held in place by the Ross Ice Shelf. The Ross Ice Shelf is melting. What if the West Antarctic ice sheet starts to move? Well, that potentially raises sea level by yards rather than fractions of an inch. And that would get people's attention because more and more of the world lives on the coasts for good reason. So these things will come along, and it'll go from this kind of low-lying, yeah, I guess I should be concerned about it thing to holy shit. And then you have a sequence of holy shit events, and then even democracies will change their policies and tax laws and deploy global governance things to get to where we feel confident that the geoengineering scheme we're going to try now at a small scale as a test, everybody agrees to it, and we go ahead and do it and then learn from the results and so on. Meanwhile, there's some other in parallel things of whitening clouds or trying to do more with biochar, and there's a seething going on as some things emerge. But it's going to be a rowdy century. I think it'll be a fantastic century to live through because so much profound stuff is going to be going on.